Hey everybody, this is Jay with Inspirion Trucking Services, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the FMCSA Hazardous Materials Basic. Our learning objective is to 1. Understand what the CSA and Basic programs are, 2. Learn about the Hazardous Materials Basic, the scoring system, and the consequences of a high score, and 3. Discover ways you can help lower its score. So, the Hazardous Materials Basic. What is the Hazardous Materials Basic? The Hazardous Materials Basic is one of 7 categories the FMCSA uses to determine how a motor carrier stacks up compared to other motor carriers with a similar number of safety events. As a recap, the 7 categories are unsafe driving, crash indicator, hours of service, compliance, vehicle maintenance, controlled substances and alcohol, driver fitness, and hazardous materials compliance. This basic ensures the hazardous materials are safely transported by commercial motor vehicles. The Hazardous Materials Intervention Threshold. For each basic, the FMCSA sets what's called an intervention threshold. If a carrier scores at or above this threshold, interventions like a warning letter or if you don't improve, an on-site inspection can occur. For the Hazardous Materials Basic, the intervention threshold is 80%. Carriers that have been evaluated as needing interventions will be subject to a variety of interventions. The specific intervention will depend on the carrier's basic scores and enforcement history. The interventions include some of the following: warning letters, increased roadside enforcement, focused off-site investigation, cooperative safety plans, notice of violations, comprehensive on-site investigations and notice of claim, penalty, and settlement agreement following an intervention if it didn't go well. So, what are some consequences of being above the intervention threshold for motor carriers? Well, a high score can lead to warning letters from the FMCSA, on-site inspections and fines, more frequent roadside inspections, and higher insurance premiums. Maintaining basic scores below the intervention threshold demonstrates to the FMCSA, and to insurance for that matter, that a fleet is operating safely. The consequences of being above the intervention threshold for drivers. So, violations can result in expensive tickets that drivers have to pay out of pocket. Violations that impact basic scores show up on the pre-employment screening program for 3 years, and if you're pulled over while driving over your hours, you'll likely be placed out of service. What are some things drivers can do to keep the basic scores down? Well, understand the basics program and what's expected of you. Driver behavior has a direct impact on how fleet ranks in a program, making it important to understand what violations carry more points and have the greatest impact on the hazardous materials basic, how long violations impact a score, and how warnings can impact basic scores just as much as a violation can. So, have clean inspections. Clean inspections positively impact a fleet's score. This is because violations drop out of the system over time. Remember, every violation during an inspection can harm basic scores even if no ticket was issued. And to prevent any issues, ensure drivers accurately track their hours of service. Stay up to date on paperwork. There are a number of specific certificate and permit requirements related to transporting hazardous materials. Drivers need to be aware of what they need to keep on file. Learn what is considered a hazardous material. So the DOT defines hazardous materials as any item or chemical which, when being transported or moved in commerce, presents a risk to public safety or the environment. This is a very broad definition, and the DOT has a hazardous materials table that includes pages of qualifying substances. What's more, it may not be apparent that what you're hauling is actually a hazardous material, so your fleet could be inadvertently handling substances you're not permitted to. It's also a good idea to include a hazardous materials review as a part of pre-trip inspections. That way any labeling issues are caught before your drivers hit the road. Participate in mandatory training. Hazardous materials employees who directly affect hazardous materials transportation safety are required to participate in specific training. General awareness training must be given to all hazardous materials employees. The purpose of this training is to educate employees on hazard communication requirements and their aim and purpose. Function-specific training should be given to all hazardous materials employees, but it should vary based on particular job functions. The DOT requires function-specific training to teach the necessary knowledge and skills and proficiencies of an individual's day-to-day tasks. It should go into detail about regulations that the individual must follow for his or her specific job function. Safety training must include information on materials that create workplace hazards and what employees should do to protect themselves. Basic emergency response procedures are an example of appropriate safety training. And lastly, security training must be given to all hazardous materials employees within 90 days of hire. This training must cover security risks associated with the hazardous materials transportation and methods to increase security. If you're required to have a security plan by the DoT, this is where you must include in-depth training on the purpose and implementation of that plan. Report all violations. Reporting basic violations allows us to stay ahead of potential issues and take action to lower our score. This can also help identify and appeal erroneous violations using data from company systems like ELDs and GPSs. Now let's talk about hazard materials best practices. DoT and FMCSA regulations for hazardous materials transport and handling can be complex. With the dangers of hazardous materials, a carrier and its drivers will be closely scrutinized, increasing the odds of a basic violation. One of the best ways to keep this basic score low is to keep in mind some of the best practices from hazardous materials handling and transport. Preventing hazardous material incidents caused by human error. Use established hazardous materials handling procedures. Continuously practice safe driving techniques. Get adequate rest and nourishment prior to your trip. Maintain high driver alertness by taking plenty of rest stops and reducing cab temperature. Reduce your vehicle speed, especially on ramps and curves. And do not shift gears while crossing train tracks. Preventing hazardous material incidents during the loading and unloading process. Check safety guides before loading and unloading begins. Remove keys from the ignition prior to loading and unloading to avoid pull-away incidents. Do not overfill or overload tanks. Be careful when handling hazardous materials, cylinders, and packages to avoid spills and leaks. Handle empty drums with the same caution as full drums. Do not overload closed cargo spaces. Allow air to circulate in these areas. And close all access flanges and valves before moving and allow adequate relaxation time. Preventing hazardous materials incidents due to packaging and labeling error. Well, become familiar with all types of hazardous material standards and procedures, including those related to packaging, labeling, marking, handling, and placarding. Responding correctly in emergency situations. Act quickly to prevent injury to yourself or others on the scene. Communicate primary hazard associated with shipment to emergency response personnel and to affected personnel in the immediate area. Know what to do with the hazardous materials cargo you carry in case of an emergency, and know all potentially dangerous properties of the load you're carrying to convey to emergency response personnel. Do not perform an aggressive response unless you're familiar with the appropriate procedures, you have the correct equipment available, and you are confident that you know all properties of all materials you are carrying. Now let's talk about using shipping papers properly. Review shipping papers carefully before pulling away, as they are the most important source of information available to identify the basic dangers of hazardous materials. Become an expert on the properties of your cargo, as shipping papers do not provide complete detailed information for emergency response professionals. And know what to do with the cargo in the event of a situation when shipping papers are unavailable or inaccessible. Become familiar with all properties of your hazardous materials cargo, as placards provide only a general information and particularly response to mixed loads. Use material-specific placards above using the general placard for flammable liquid. Make sure all hazardous materials are correctly labeled before loading, as the way material is labeled will subsequently determine handling procedures, applicable placards, emergency response procedures necessary, shipping papers, and safe distribution of mixed loads. Do not rely solely on package labels in emergency situations, especially if you did not double check them before loading, as they provide only limited information even when they are correct. And review guidance from the DoT on proper placarding protocols. Proper hazardous materials packaging. Know the appropriate packaging techniques for all materials you deal with, as packaging is the first line of defense for containing hazardous materials in the event of an accident. Before loading, ensure materials properly packaged, because inadequate packaging is commonly cited as a contributing factor to hazardous materials incidents. And inform management if you feel you need additional training on proper hazardous materials packaging techniques. Alright, so let's talk about a summary of the key points and takeaways. The FMCSA uses the CSA program to score motor carriers on safety categories called Basics. This program helps identify potentially dangerous employers. Driver behavior has a direct impact on these scores, and it's important to avoid violations at all costs. Help maintain a low score by following the rules of the road, and with time, violations will drop out of the system. This has been Jay with Inspirion Trucking Services, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video and learn more about the Hazardous Materials Basic. With any questions, or if you need help on how to create a program to address any safety concerns or to learn more about the basics, feel free to give us a call at 702-979-3299, or you can send us an email at info@iisnv.com. Thank you.